Good morning, depending on your time zone. I'm delighted to be moderating this fireside chat and to welcome you on behalf of IAFI's Online Events Committee. I'm Caroline Duman. I'm the Managing Director of IAFI, and I'm really pleased to be here with today's event, which is part of our ongoing Fireside Chat series. And this provides the opportunity to do deep dives with IAFI scholars on their work, including books that have been released recently. And we do have online events in a range of other event tracks, so please do look out for more information about these. And you can also catch up on past events on a range of topics relating to feminist economics. And you can find these on IAFI's YouTube channel, which you should find the link to in the chat. So today's event is recorded and it will also be posted to IAFI's YouTube site. So you can watch it again later or encourage your friends and colleagues to watch it. And this is a Zoom meeting, it's not a webinar. So please do remember to keep yourself muted. And there'll be a question and answer session at the end of the presentations. And please do feel free to use the raise hand function to ask your questions. And also, at the same time, put any questions or comments you may have in the chat throughout the presentations, and feel free also to share relevant resources you might have. This is really, the term fireside chat really means that it is the opportunity for different people to participate in the conversation with our invitees today. So I'm particularly pleased to be chairing today's event because my background is in law. I work for IAFI, a feminist economics organization, as you know, but my background is actually legal. And throughout my career, I've used human rights law as a tool for working towards economic and social justice. And so this makes me additionally impatient to hear the presentations and to learn more about the book we're going to be discussing today. So to turn to our invitees, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Jodie Heyman. Dr. Heyman is the founding director of the World Policy Analysis Center. She's Distinguished Professor of Public Affairs, Public Health and Medicine at UCLA, and an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences. She leads the largest independent effort to improve the level and quality of comparative policy data available to policymakers, researchers and the public. She's an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences and has authored and edited more than 500 publications, including 19 books. And I must say a particularly thanks to Jodie because it's very early in the morning for you. So we're delighted to have you here. Amy Raub is Principal Research Analyst at the World Policy Analysis Center. And for her, it's late in the evening. You're in Australia. And she's also an economist with 2 decades of experience working on discrimination and inequality. Her work focuses on the development of quantitative measures of laws and policies in all 193 UN countries, and how these measures can be used to advance monitoring, accountability, and evidence-based change. So last but not least, we have Alita Sprague, who's in the US, in the East Coast of the US, who's a senior legal analyst at World and an attorney whose career has focused on advancing public policies and laws that address inequality. She's co-authored a range of publications that look at how laws and policies shape racial, gender, and socioeconomic disparities. And most recently, a book entitled Advancing Equality, a book that evaluates approaches to protecting equal rights in 193 constitutions. So my first question is for Jodie and Amy, and I'd be glad if you could share with us what led you to establish World, and also what does World stand for? And can you tell us about the evolution of your work on gender and how that work relates to feminist economics?
Great. Well, first, thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you so much to IAFI. It's really, to everyone who's coming, it's a total pleasure to be here with you. It is 5 a.m. here in California, so it's just to say, happy to talk to you too in a day if I may sound more coherent and it's later in the morning, but it's great to be here. So what led us to do this, so we started this effort, the First Studies of Laws and World is an acronym for the World Legal Rights Database. So it has its core basis in the law, was how difficult it was 2 decades ago to know what the world was doing. How could we have accountability, true accountability, if we didn't know which countries had which rights, if we couldn't in a minute see whether policymakers had made commitments and met them? This arose when we went to the UN and asked, what information do you have on childcare? Care was one of the first topics because we knew how core it was to gender equality. And the answer at that time was, we're happy to share, go through these 15 boxes of papers in Paris that the countries have sent in to us. Of course, that was totally unrealistic for most people to do. So fast forward to now, and where are we? And I want to say that while that early story was about inaccessibility, I think so many of the UN agencies have played a central role in collecting this data, in bringing together what's known. And yet they face real challenges from political pressures in making true accountability happen, transparency, which countries are far behind. And we've seen that time and time again. So where's that leave us focus? And I'm going to pass it to Amy. Where we are now is legal rights across really thousands of measures that you can see in seconds on a map in all 6 UN languages that build on the tremendous work of different global organizations, civil society, non-governmental and governmental, but make it readily accessible, and we'll get to later, analyzable with econometrics. Over to you, Amy.
Yeah, and our real evolution, I think, over the past 20 years has been going from those basic questions of, do you have this law, which was so important for getting that visibility of, do you have the details that really matter to the range of experiences that different women face, recognizing that different women have different experiences, that women with disabilities face different barriers, that women with less education, that women working in the informal economy have access to different rights or different services. So trying to understand not just the law, but who has access, what are the benefits, also, how are those laws implemented? How are they enforced? How are those rights protected? And then finally, taking that last step and linking to outcomes to really study and, what is the impact of these laws? And we'll talk about that as we go.
Great, thanks a lot. I mean, that's really interesting background, and I can see what a useful resource it is. And let's actually now turn to the book itself and the project that we're featuring in today's session. So let me recall the title: Equality Within Our Lifetimes, How Laws and Policies Can Close or Widen Gender Gaps in Economies Worldwide. And I think the link to the book or to the presentation of the book you'll be able to find that in the chat. I'd like to ask the question, and perhaps to Alita and Jody also, but what can you share with us about the motivation for the book project and how that determined the scope of what you covered in terms of topics in the book?
Sure. So I'm happy to kick us off, and I just wanted to echo Jody's thanks for being here. It's really wonderful to be able to participate in this event. So as Amy and Jody already described a little bit, gender equality has been a longtime focus of our center, and we've built data over many years in diverse areas that matter to gender equality. But one thing that really catalyzed bringing it all together in this format was seeing these estimates year after year about how it would take hundreds of years to achieve gender equality in the economy globally at the current rate of progress, whether it's from UN Women or the World Economic Forum. I think we've all probably seen these headlines that it's, consistently one huge number, 150 years, 250 years. And our perspective was that the extent to which gender equality is embedded in and driven by law has been largely overlooked in some of those conversations. And that's not just explicitly discriminatory laws, but also those laws that reinforce restrictive gender norms, that individualize or privatize these societal care needs, both for children and adults, and that take unpaid work generally, primarily done by women, for granted. So we saw this project as an opportunity to bring all the data together on topics ranging from discrimination at work to sexual harassment to paid leave for caregiving to education, and really document both how laws are perpetuating inequality, but also to share how changing them could accelerate that timeline. Jody, did you want to add anything?
Thanks. The only thing I'll add, so it's a joy to speak to Yafi because we know everybody on the call cares deeply about these issues. And I want to say, though, because, I think even among people who care about these issues, when they hear the title, within our lifetime, there's reaction of, oh, never within our lifetimes. And what the ambition of the book is, we should all be outraged by the acceptance of that. We should all, we should all be activated, deeply troubled by the notion that we have to accept these long time horizons. There is no reason why this many millennia into human beings living together, we should have this much inequality for half the world's population, and it should continue. I think you'll hear as we present the findings that the core finding is it's structured into the law. This is not by chance. Most of the inequalities we see in participation, in marginalization, in success in the economy are clearly in care, are clearly embedded in the law, structured, perpetuated. There are avenues we can change. We should have a guideline of where to start.
Great. Yeah, thanks. No, that's really interesting. And it's true, within our lifetimes, that does sort of put a color on it, doesn't it? And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more, perhaps, Alita, you've mentioned, and Jody also, you've mentioned some of the legal, the ways that the laws entrench or inequalities. I wondered if you could give us some more specific answers of some of the gender gaps. I think some of the explicit ones we can think of, but perhaps some of maybe some examples of a specific one that can actually affect economic rights and outcomes.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And, I think we're going to get into a lot of the details of the findings as we move forward and share some of the slides. But there are examples across all the areas that we look at, whether or not both gender discrimination and caregiving discrimination are covered, whether leave laws allow both, all caregivers, regardless of gender, to take adequate and equal amounts of leave for a full range of caregiving purposes, whether there are disparities in the minimum age of marriage. These inequalities really span a lot of different areas of the law. But one other thing I just wanted to touch on is whether these laws matter, whether changing the laws matter, because that's a question that we get a lot as a legal data center. And in the book and the launch materials, what we try to do is bring together 3 different kinds of evidence to answer that question of how laws and whether laws and how laws matter. So the first is just a review of the literature, which includes studies from across countries and across regions showing how laws have had impact. And I don't think I have time to give much detail, but there really is a lot there, especially when it comes to the impacts of caregiving policies on women's economic outcomes. And within that review, we also include our own policy impact studies that I think Amy is going to touch on a little bit later. But to put simply, since we have these longitudinal data sets of policies in areas like tuition-free education and maternity leave, we're able to really rigorously analyze how changes in policies affect changes in outcomes across countries, even if they are imperfectly implemented. And the second type of evidence we try to present is case law. So throughout the book, we include examples of how laws have been used in the courts to secure justice for individual women or large groups of women workers, or to change policies and practices that are discriminatory. And these span countries and issues. So, some of the interesting cases we present include elder care workers in New Zealand who won better pay for elder care workers as a class through a guaranteed equal pay for work of equal value. We also look at a case from female mine workers in the US who brought the first class action sexual harassment suit. Individual women in China who contested discriminatory job postings. And we know, of course, there are many barriers to pursuing justice through the traditional court system. But one way we reckon with that challenge is also by looking at what the law itself does to support implementation and enforcement, which is something we're going to touch on a little bit later as well. And then lastly, we devote a chapter of the book to case studies of civil society organizations that have worked in a range of countries to advance new legislation that matters to gender equality or improve its implementation. And I think some of those stories really make the potential of law's impact tangible, and also highlight some of these more subtle ways that inequality can be baked into the law. I think one of the most powerful examples comes from a small organization founded by two women in Jordan who made it their mission to actually enforce a law that was on the books that required certain workplaces to provide childcare. And thanks to their efforts, about 50 large companies established new childcare centers just in the first phase of their campaign. But beyond implementing the law, they also identified how its details were perpetuating inequality, because at the time that they started, the law only required companies to provide childcare if they had a certain number of women workers with children of a certain age. And they succeeded in amending that to say a certain number of workers, regardless of gender, who have small children. So I think the short answer on how laws matter, whether laws matter, is that they do. They matter more when they're fully enforced, but even if they're only partially implemented, we have evidence showing they make a difference in addressing both some of these explicit inequalities in the law and these more subtle ways that laws can perpetuate disparities.
Very interesting. Yeah. It's good to have these concrete examples, because it helps us really understand where the problems lie. So you mentioned this case in Jordan and the workplace. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more to let's dig into one of the themes is about laws and policies regarding discrimination and harassment in the world of work. Can you tell us a bit more about these?
Yes, absolutely. So I will, I'm going to share my screen because I think we all have a few slides. So I'll kick us off with that. Let's see. Okay, is everyone able to see that? Great. So I'll just walk through some of our findings in different areas of discrimination and sexual harassment. This first slide looks at protections against gender discrimination at work in different areas. And the quick story here is that the substantial majority of countries prohibit at least some forms of gender discrimination at work, but those protections drop off in some of the areas that really matter most to advancement and to access to leadership positions. So at the top, we see most protect pay, but far fewer protect against discrimination, promotions, and demotions, and even fewer in access to training opportunities. So the gaps in the law really map on to some of the big gaps that we see in women's economic outcomes, as far as being overrepresented in entry-level positions, but underrepresented at the top. I mean, we also look separately at protections against discrimination on the basis of statuses around caregiving. And I think this is interesting because here we see a sharp drop, whereas 93% of countries take some approach to gender discrimination, just half cover any aspect of caregiving discrimination at the workplace. And this probably doesn't need much of an explanation for this audience, since this is a group very engaged in these kinds of issues, but we look separately at whether countries prohibit caregiving discrimination for two main reasons. And the first is just that protections against gender discrimination don't always extend discrimination based on caregiving responsibilities or even related physical conditions like pregnancy or breastfeeding. And we've seen this in case law from a range of countries. But beyond those very practical impacts, we know that prohibiting discrimination based on family responsibilities matters to norms. It matters to creating workplace cultures where it's expected and understood that workers of all genders have full lives, and that this often means that outside of work, they're caring for children, they're caring for spouses, partners, aging parents. So looking at whether the law establishes that these really common, nearly universal responsibilities can't justify discrimination, is important for assuring that workers, regardless of gender, can meet these caregiving needs in their lives without being passed over for a promotion or being tracked into a role with less responsibility. But then again, even across caregiving statuses, as you can see here, there's a lot of variation. Pregnancy is covered pretty frequently, but then paternal status, fathers get the least amount of coverage, which is, has implications when we're thinking about shifting norms around care. We also look at common forms of discrimination that women are likely to face at work based on other aspects of their identity. Again, not something I need to remind this audience, but it's very well established across countries that there are vast inequalities among women at work based on race, migration status, disability, other aspects of identity. So we know that just prohibiting discrimination based on gender is insufficient to reach much of the discrimination that women at work face. And here we can see that some intersecting grounds like religion and race are covered pretty widely. Again, this is out of 193 countries. So those grounds are covered widely, though not universally, but protections remain very low in some areas, including sexual orientation, gender identity, and migration status. At the same time, we do see that legal protections across different aspects of identity are rising without exception, which is encouraging. And this is one thing that having the longitudinal data enables us to do, is really look at these trends over time and see where, areas where rights are strengthening on a global scale and others where there might be retrenchment. So just as one example here, from 2016 to 2021, 6 countries introduced laws prohibiting discrimination at work based on sexual orientation. Another 10 did so for gender identity. So even though those are aspects of identity that receive very little protection in the law globally, they are also areas where we're seeing movement at the national level. I'm just going to do 2 slides on sexual harassment, which we devote a chapter of the book to as well. So the top line finding around sexual harassment is that even several years after Me Too became this movement that really went around the world, about a quarter of countries globally still have no law that specifically prohibits sexual harassment in the workplace. Among those that do, the strength of protections really varies. So some countries only prohibit quid pro quo harassment, but don't address hostile work environment. A substantial number have a pretty broad definition, a comprehensive definition of sexual harassment, but only prohibit it when it's perpetrated by a supervisor rather than a peer or somebody else in the workplace. But there are countries that are doing it pretty comprehensively. So 32 countries, which are represented by the green in this visualization, address all forms of sexual harassment by all people in the workplace. So they provide that strong foundation for addressing sexual harassment wherever it occurs. And then lastly, this slide looks a little bit about some of the pieces around enforcement and implementation, which I briefly mentioned earlier. So we know that just having laws on the books may be insufficient to ensure that they're realized. But when we look at the legislation, there are also ways that countries can sort of create this scaffolding, for better implementation and enforcement. And here again, we see substantial variation. So there are 55 countries that prohibit sexual harassment, but they don't prohibit retaliation when someone reports it, which of course undermines the effectiveness of the law, since we know across countries many reasons women don't report sexual harassment is because they fear the consequences. They fear losing their job. They fear, some kind of reprisal. At the same time, there are, again, lots of countries that take a strong approach. The 58 countries are the ones represented in green, and they not only prohibit retaliation, but also require employers to take preventive steps, which, we think is a really important piece of this, especially considering the barriers to justice that women may experience, that they have to go through the courts. If there are these more proactive efforts to prevent discrimination and harassment before it happens, that can be one other effective way that the law can create more equal workplaces. So I'm going to stop sharing now. I'll pass it back. Thanks.
Great. No, really interesting to get the specifics and to realize that it's not just that law is one stage, but then the actual implementation or application of the law is another stage. Very, very important point to remember. And moving now onto a point that you already touched on, but it would be interesting to know a bit more about the question of care work. So as everybody here probably knows, care has long been a focus of feminist economists, and what is now seeking increased recognition in policy spaces, in particular due to the impacts of COVID. I'd be really interested if you could speak to your findings on care more specifically.
Sure. I mean, as care is virtually inseparable from work on gender at this point. Even before the pandemic, the ILO estimated that there were 606 million women out of work due to unpaid care work, compared to just 41 million men. So when we think about care, one of the first things we think about is caregiving during infancy. So this map looks at just at the very start of care needs. Is there paid leave for women around the birth of a child? And this map really highlights the power of having data to visualize the gap. You can really instantly see all of the nearly every country in the world has at least some paid leave for mothers to care for an infant around the birth of a child. The only countries that don't are those in red: the US, Papua New Guinea, and just a few small South Pacific Island states. And in fact, paid maternity leave is one of the earliest, or the earliest, social protection policy targeted at women. And it's been around for more than 100 years in many countries. And all of these countries in green have at least 14 weeks. They're meeting that ILO standard that was established. And we know that paid leave is really important. It helps to support women's health. It helps to support infant health. It also helps to support women's attachment to the labor force. So it matters to not only health, but to businesses, to national economies, because it helps women come back to their jobs. But at the same time, if we care about the gender gap in care, we can't only aim our care policies at women, because we, as Alita mentioned, these policies are can also just reinforce norms that women are the only caregivers. So we also looked at, well, are policies reinforcing norms that only women provide care? So policies can also help to shift important norms around men providing care as well. And we know that men want to provide care during infancy, and infancy can be an important time to establish men's roles as caregivers as well. And you can see from this map, much less of the world provides paid leave for men during infancy. Only 63% of the world has paid paternity leave. And when it's provided, it tends to be much shorter, and it's structured in a way that men are less likely to take paid leave. So men are more likely to take paid leave when it's reserved for them and when it's well paid. But often it's very short, so it's not long enough to really enable that kind of engagement, that longer period of bonding that really sets those caregiving roles, that gives the opportunities for more involved caregiving from the start, for more engaged caregiving long-term that can allow for more equal care across the life course and more equal opportunities in the economy. Of course, the data also has the upside, like Alita showed with discrimination at work, where laws have improved over time. Parental leave laws have also improved over time, but for the paid parental leave laws, we have a longer tail on this. So we've been collecting this data for a longer period. We've also built this data back in time all the way to 1995 to the Beijing Platform for Action. We have a lot of detail on this data, and we've seen that since 1995, paid leave for fathers has actually tripled globally. In some regions, like the African Union, it's quadrupled. The action in the past decade or so is particularly marked, with a lot of countries taking really intentional steps towards reserving leave for fathers, really markedly increasing that amount of leave, so that dads can take a more involved role in caregiving. So these are really encouraging steps. But I'm glad you raised the pandemic and caregiving before, because of course, the one thing the pandemic highlighted is that care needs don't end at infancy, but unfortunately, in many countries, support for care does. So when we look at paid leave for children's health needs, there's just such a tremendous drop off when you go from infancy to childhood and the support that we have for parents to be able to take paid leave. Just over half have any paid leave at all for children's serious health needs. Even fewer do it for things like everyday colds. So when you're thinking about needing to keep your child home for an infectious cold, we don't have support for parents to do that. Even worse, when you're thinking about serious illnesses, something like cancer, where you would require lengthy treatments, something that's really going to disrupt a parent's career, most likely the mother's career. Very few countries have policies that are going to provide that kind of support to remain attached to the labor force in a meaningful way and to have that income support. Only about a quarter even have 6 weeks or more. Elder care is even worse. As we think about the aging population, we have very little support for workers to be able to balance elder care needs. So here we see less than 40% of the world provides workers with any paid leave to care for an aging parent, less than 20% 2 weeks of paid leave. That's really nothing when you think about the types of care needs you might need to care for a parent who might have a heart attack, who might be in the hospital with end-of-life care needs, stroke, dementia, any other type of longer-term care needs. And when you just look at the red, there's so much of the world that doesn't have these types of care needs. And we've also examined these across other types of family member relationships like spouse, sisters, grandparents, other loved ones, partners. And so we can see the full range of relationships and how there's just a lack of care support. There are countries doing important steps, showing important leadership in these policy areas, but much more needs to be done, particularly as we face these challenges of an aging global population with increasing care needs.
Thanks. So yes, still, it's good to see, heartening to see progress in some areas, but you've made us very aware that there are other areas where a lot of progress is still needed. So you've mentioned the database, and which is really great. And I'd just like to draw the attention of people listening in to the chat. I hope you've been keeping an eye on it, because there've been some really great resources posted there. So please, take a, copy those or consult them. I think you'll find them very enriching and useful. And also, I also want to recall that we will have a chance for discussion and question and answers after the presentation in a few minutes. So please, also, if you already have comments or questions, do please feel free to drop them into the chat. And what I want to ask now, and I think perhaps Jody, you could answer this, well, probably you all could answer this, but let me turn to you, Jody, about the database of laws and policies for all these 193 countries. Can you tell us a little bit more about that database, and specifically, how does it offer opportunities for empirical analysis? And can you also indicate, I assume you'll be able to share your screen. Could you also show how people can proceed if they want to get more data through the database or otherwise?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So across, I'll begin, and I know Amy will continue on some of the empirical analysis pieces. So I'll just start by saying, as a center, we believe that change is a team sport. So what does that mean? That means a couple things. First, you're meeting just 3 of us, but there are 18 people, multilingual, multidisciplinary, international, who are building this. We are privileged and lucky to have had and continue to have partnerships with civil society in over 100 countries. We work with policymakers in every region, and we are eager to work with anybody on this call who would like to collaborate. So I'm going to show you some resources and links to them. We do think of a talk like this more like you're getting a quick taste of everything. I realize that it must feel like that means you don't get to dive deeply enough into any individual piece. That's both why there are resources in chat, but also we won't leave this without your knowing how to reach us if you want to dive more deeply into any topic. So I'll screen share now, just to tell you a little bit about how to access these resources. Okay. So first is just a quick image of what the landing page on our website. The website is at worldpolicycenter.org, and you can spell center either way that you would like. So when you get there, if you go to that 3-line bar, that's a menu bar on so many websites, you just download it, you will see data download. So that it's straightforward. What will you download there? You will download the cross-sectional data. You'll have a series of data sources. If you want some of the more longitudinal data, please do feel free to reach out to us. Now, I want to say that we link those databases to a series of surveys in 90 plus countries. We do this in partnership. We're not allowed to put all the survey data online because others have, we collect the policy data, but DHS, mix, the income and economic surveys are collected by others, have permission requirements for it. But this is just to say we have a series of collaborations with research partners around the world that have led to studies in that. And we welcome being able to partner on using this data on a series of studies that link to those. The other kind of thing besides econometric studies for people who are more qualitative in their focus is the database does have legislative language and detailed legislative language that you can get to look at how different countries, parse how different countries are approaching similar issues. And then we've developed a whole methodology for doing this. We can dive more deeply into that during the Q&A, but we have partnered. This is a map from a climate change adaptation partnership we did a number of years ago. We are happy to work with centers who may want to measure laws and policies in a new
Jody,
area.
I don't know, sorry to interrupt you. I don't know if it's just me, but I can't see yours. I don't think I can see your presentation moving on. I think I'm still on the first page.
Oh, so it went
is that the
for
case for
me,
everybody
but
else?
it didn't move for others, huh?
It didn't move for me. I don't know about anybody else.
So sorry, let me, I will instead, not sure why that was, because it was moving on mine, but let me just, I'm gonna instead just screen share. Let's see this. How about, can people see our homepage now? This is an actual live page. You're muted, Carolyn.
I can see it, yes.
Okay, great. So if you can see this, so now you're on the actual homepage. I'm going to go to our menu. If you want to go to a different language presentation, you can change the language of the homepage. If you want to go to our maps and data, you can go straight to the data download. That will bring you to a page where you can request different data sets.
Mm-hmm.
This most recent is the gender equality in the economy data set. It will let you do that. If you're just interested in findings, you can click on global maps and you can pick, I hope, can everybody see the areas? You can pick an area that you want to go to. We'll take we'll take equal rights and discrimination. And it will bring you to all of your choices. It'll bring you both to our academic resources, to more detail on our methods, and it will let you view a whole group of specific policy areas. Here are the examples: workplace discrimination, all the way through non-discrimination at school. Finally, it will let you bring up a map of a specific area. And on these maps, it will let you hover over a country and learn what that country does. So for time, I'll stop sharing there, but just to say they're designed to be really freely, readily accessible. I'm sorry that people couldn't see everything before. But the main point of what I was advancing was just to show that it is very readily easily ways for you to partner with us on deeper econometric studies if you reach out. Back to you, Carolyn.
Thanks. No, that's fascinating. And I'm really impatient. I'm itching for, well, I'm itching to be able to get my hands on it and explore in more detail myself afterwards. Thanks. And since this is an IAFI hosted conversation, I'd like to focus a little bit on some of the econometric methodologies. And I wonder if I could turn to you, Amy, and ask you to reflect on your perspective on this work as an economist. Where do you feel like there is rigorous economic work that has been done? And where do you feel that there are gaps and opportunities?
Sure. So I think we've hinted and touched on this a bit along the way, but I'll just expand on it a bit. I think the really exciting thing that this data enables is having the longitudinal policy data. When you pair it with longitudinal household survey data, lets us take advantage of these natural policy experiments to really test and use quasi-experimental methods, difference in difference techniques to look at the impact of policy on outcomes in a way that we couldn't normally do. So you can't run a randomized controlled trial on a policy. It's not ethical. So usually you're left, trying to find a single country study that works and take advantage of cohorts. But this lets you really identify multiple countries that you could use, treatment countries, and then you can find good control countries to compare to. Jody's mentioned the DHS surveys. For people who aren't familiar with those are the demographic and health surveys. IPUMS has harmonized those. Those are available online, public use. Those have outcomes on early childhood, on maternal and reproductive health, on household decision-making, on interpersonal violence. So why should you care about those as a feminist economist? What has that enabled us to do? Well, let's take the example of paid maternity leave. Research from high-income countries had shown that it really mattered to infant mortality leave. But when we were sharing the data early on, a lot of people said, well, yeah, but that doesn't matter in low-income settings because too many people are working in the informal economy. It's not going to work here. So there were real questions. Do these policies actually work when so many people are working in the informal economy? Will they work with help with the administration, with the implementation? So with partners using the longitudinal policy data and the harmonized DHS data, we were able to identify countries where maternity leave had extended. Those were the treatment countries, matched them to control countries where the paid maternity leave policy hadn't changed because we had household level data that gave us the researchers could control for household level factors, control for individual level factors, control for country level factors, change over time, use difference in difference techniques, and give really rigorous answers that yes, paid maternity leave does matter in lower income settings. It does matter for infant mortality. In subsequent studies, we're also able to identify plausible pathways that paid maternity leave increased breastfeeding, it lowered bloody diarrhea, it increased vaccination rates. Presumably mothers had the time to be able to take their children to clinics. So this type of data has real power to be able to show those impacts. Just one other example from those DHS data series to give you another sense of the type of data available through there. Another question around child marriage laws. These types of laws are hard to enforce. Do these laws really matter? Looking at intimate partner violence, Again, finding that yes, these laws were having a kind of both normative impact and an impact on actually reducing exposure to violence. So we've done with partners, researchers at our center and partners have done a fair amount of studies using the DHS data. There's certainly a lot more that can be done with the DHS data. And again, the DHS data is readily available. It's got a wide range of data available on child outcomes, on maternal and reproductive health, and some on education as well. The piece that's really been missing to date, and the piece that I'm really excited about, and I would hope this group would get excited about as well, is just the economic outcomes. There's been a lot less harmonized data. So we're excited that with the partnership with the World Bank, we've actually been able to get our hands on some harmonized economic outcome data. And we've had some researchers within our center working on that, and some very preliminary findings looking like we may be seeing some real impacts in an increase in the likelihood of non-vulnerable employment from laws prohibiting discrimination at work. And so this is the first real study of this type showing that these laws prohibiting discrimination at work having an impact on women's employment outcome or women's economic outcomes. So that, is really exciting. Getting to work with this economic data is really exciting. And there hasn't been much done in this sphere on economic outcomes just because there hasn't been much quality harmonized economic data outcome available. And we're really excited to continue that work and very eager to have people working on it with us if they're interested.
Thanks a lot. Yes, that's very inspiring. And I can think of a lot of areas where this could be really fruitful for helping have concrete sort of evidence-based conversations about impacts of different kind of macroeconomic policies. So I, for one, look forward to talking to you more about this. But what I'd like to do now is to open the floor to any questions or discussion. And as I said at the beginning, and as you know, this is a chat between everybody present, not a webinar. So do, everybody do feel free to switch on your cameras, then we can, have the impression of being here together. And if you do have any questions or comments, please raise your hand and I'm happy to take them. So while waiting for others to ask the questions, may I jump in with one? I worked prior to joining IAFI, and then probably IAFI will work in an ongoing way with CEDAW, the Women's Rights Committee at the UN, and I see that you occasionally submit reports to CEDAW. And I have two questions in this regard. First of all, what's your thoughts on this, how to bridge the gap between sort of a legal perspective and an economics perspective? And I ask specifically because CEDAW has been asking us for briefings on macroeconomic policy and women's rights. And I see it's a challenge about how to make it concrete, how to make a sort of macroeconomic, reasoning concrete in terms of, the legal outcomes. And I'm sure this is something you've thought about. And linked to that, the question of accountability. And one of the earlier points you made, you were saying about how, first of all, you can have a law on the books, okay, a law on the books is better than no law, but then having the law in itself is not much use if nobody's actually enforcing it. But then how do you go to accountability? So some things we know need to be done for people to enjoy their rights, for women and men to have equal rights. But then how can one think about actually accountability, perhaps for economic policies?
Those are great questions, and maybe I'll take the first step on accountability and see if my colleagues want to build on it. So we think transparency is a key part of accountability. So I'll just give a couple examples. There are lots of countries that where leaders have said women have equal rights, where the constitutions guarantee equal rights, and where there are still disparities in the law, inequalities in the law. There are even more countries that have signed on to CEDAW or ICESCR or any of the many instruments that guarantee gender equality, let alone the SDGs, which guarantees in 5.1.1 legal equality, but still have embedded in the law, women get 6 months of paid maternity leave, dads get 2 days. We know that that creates inequality from this, not just in infancy, but throughout childhood. That still have 60 countries still have disparities in the age at which girls and boys can marry, again, creating inequality from the start. The countries that don't address intersectional discrimination or multiple discrimination in the workplace. So we hope sharing these maps that are in the book on the web that partners share is a quick way to say, let's first do the legal gap, but also in countries that have the law, empower citizens to have a way to measure whether countries are standing up to that law. So for all the economists on this, we think it is really important. Let's take all those countries that have a law against child marriage, which fuels inequality, and measure how many girls are getting married. If they're getting married and there's a law, it's not being implemented. Let's collect in the surveys, and that's part of the econometric studies that Amy was showing that we're starting to do. Let's look when there's non-discrimination, how is that changing outcomes? So we think that the role of data and transparency is incredibly important on that. I'll just say briefly on the economic link. We believe in equality from a fundamental human rights standpoint, and we believe you can demonstrate economic benefit. So it's how do we do both?
Great, thanks. No, that's really interesting. And we're unfortunately almost out of time. So there are many other questions it would be good to address. But let me just raise one about collaborate, I think very practical one about, staying in touch in the future. June Poe, who unfortunately says she has to leave quite soon, but she asked, how could somebody interested in care ethics, who's not so much of a legal specialist or an economist, how could they partner with your center? And well, how could anyone, can you tell us a bit more about how anyone, including the specific configuration she mentioned, could partner with your center? And since we're coming to the end of the hour we've allocated for this, and I'm sure you all have busy days ahead, I'd like to open that question to the three of you, Alita, Amy, and Jody. And if you have any responses to that, and if you want to share with us any other final reflections on the project, in terms of, and as well, strategic directions, roles for research, and partnering with you in the future. So let me hand over to Alita first, and then I'll hand over to Amy and Jody for your quick responses on that.
Sure, I'm happy to kick us off. I mean, I think there are a range of different ways we've partnered with different organizations, different academics, people working in different fields. We've partnered with a lot of civil society organizations working to advance change in countries by providing them, kind of tailored data around issues that they're working on. So if they're working to advance paid paternity leave in a country in a particular region, we can provide comparative data showing how their countries compare within that region or within that socioeconomic grouping of countries. And we found that can sometimes be a pretty effective way to advance change at the country level compared to the full global data. We also, we collaborate with academics working in law and other disciplines on more academic articles. We're happy to collaborate on writing opportunities. And we also do, workshops, more detailed workshops about how to use the data for different purposes. I know we're short on time, so I will pass to Amy to share some other examples.
Yeah, I would just say we're a very multidisciplinary team, and we recognize the strengths that all of these different disciplines bring together, and also the challenges that achieving equality within our lifetime presents. But if we're going to actually achieve this, we all do need to work together. So we very much welcome partnerships. And I see Jody's popping in the chat a range of emails. So yes, please do be in touch, and we welcome people reaching out to us.
And I didn't finish, but you're welcome to reach out to me too. Mine is just my name, Jody.Hyman, with the same end on it. I saw in the chat questions about unpaid care, and just want to say we do a lot on unpaid care and the way in which laws do structure it. That's why you heard us talking about maternity leave and paternity leave. It's the notion, and caregiving discrimination is the notion that all of these shape who gives unpaid care at home and how it's given. We have lots more on that. We would really welcome speaking about that. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us, either as individuals or as collectives. If there's a group either on this video chat or at your center working on the topic, we'd welcome more conversations. We're eager to learn about all your work.
Well, thanks a lot. I think, yes, we could have spent a lot more time going into these different issues, but this has been a really good introduction to it. I personally have appreciated it immensely. And just seeing some of the messages that I'm getting privately in the chat, I know others have too. Some of them have said it publicly, but others have been more discreet in saying it individually. So this has been hugely appreciated. Thank you so much to the three of you, Alita, Amy, and Jody. And we do look forward to being in touch further. And a reminder to you, you speakers and others on this in this fireside chat, that the video will be available for public viewing. So feel free to share it afterwards. And
thank you, Carolyn. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who's joining now and later. Thank you to Mumbi, who has been organizing this so beautifully, and to Mary, who did all the work before.
Great. Yes. And yes, so have a good day. Let me wish everybody a good day or evening or afternoon, depending on where you are, and look forward to being in touch soon. And I just want to remind you that it is possible to watch previous sessions and this one on our YouTube channel, which I've just popped into the chat one last time. Goodbye, everybody, and a big thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.